Welcome, everybody. Our guest today is Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, who joins us from Jakarta, Indonesia. Dr. Anwar is a research professor at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, and she is the vice chair of the board of directors at the Habibie Center in Jakarta, after having served as the chair of democracy and human rights at that center. Between 2010 and 2017, Dr. Anwar served as the Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs to Indonesian Vice President Boediono, and then as Deputy for Government Policy Support to Indonesian Vice President Kala. From 1998 to 1999, she also held the positions of Assistant to the Vice President for Global Affairs and International Relations and Assistant Minister and State Secretary for Foreign Affairs during the Habibie presidency. Dr. Anwar is one of Southeast Asia's foremost commentators on regional political and security issues. She sits on a number of advisory boards, such as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, and a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Dr. Anwar was a congressional fellow at the U.S. Congress. From 1990 to 1991, she earned her BA and MA from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and she earned her PhD from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Anwar has been the author of numerous articles covering foreign policy and security affairs, and I highly recommend dipping into them from time to time. We have Dr. Anwar here today to explain Indonesia's important role on the international stage and what this means for the United States, Southeast Asia, and the broader global community. Dr. Anwar, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you, broadly speaking, where you see relations between Indonesia and the United States heading under this new Biden administration. I know that President Trump was criticized for not having attended ASEAN summits during his time in office. What are Jakarta's hopes for the new Biden administration? Does it hope that Washington will begin engaging Indonesia and ASEAN a bit more broadly?
Well, yes, clearly, if one believes the latest survey carried out by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies on state of Southeast Asia, that high expectations of the Biden presidency is clearly shown there. That there is this improved perceptions of the United States. There is a clear disappointment towards the Trump administration that the Trump administration was not as engaged as the previous Obama administration. During the Obama, there was this clear pivot to Asia, rebalancing towards Asia, and engaging with ASEAN was a key policy. During that time, as we know, the United States acceded to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia and was included in the membership of the East Asia Summit, which is of course ASEAN driven, and also relations at the bilateral level. Obama has personal relationship with Indonesia, so he had a very special place, put it that way, at a personal level with people in Indonesia. And that was lost during the Trump period. And also because Trump was disengaged with Southeast Asia, and also a lot of his policies were seen to be anti-Muslim. So if we have to understand that Indonesian perceptions of the United States is not simply shaped by how the US behaves in the region towards Indonesia at the bilateral level, or towards ASEAN, or in the wider, beyond ASEAN region, but also how the US as a global power behaves at the global level, particularly its policies towards Muslim countries, given the fact that Indonesia is the largest Muslim nation. That also shapes perceptions. In fact, that shapes even more perceptions among the majority of the public. And because of a lot of Trump's policies were seen to be not friendly towards Islam, particularly on the Palestinian issue, particularly the moving of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that really shaped perceptions that were seen that the US was not friendly, towards the Islamic world in general. So at the wider public, that shaped perception as much as Trump's lack of interest in the region. So the Biden administration, we don't really know yet what the administration is going to be like. But given the fact that Joe Biden served as Obama's vice president for 2 terms and supported a lot of the engagements with the region, as well as the support for multilateral organizations and engagement with the world at large, and a softer approach towards Iran, for example, and support for 2-state solution between Israel and Palestinian. So there is a lot of expectations that the Biden presidency will follow most of the foreign policy that was carried out under the Obama administration. So there is this a willingness, a predisposition, I would say, to welcome the Biden administration, that it will be a reset of US foreign policy, you might say, that could do away with what had happened during the more destructive policy of the Trump era.
How does Jakarta view the growing rivalry between Washington and Beijing, and how is it trying to handle that?
Well, rivalry between great powers are nothing new in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, a lot of Southeast Asian nations were born at the height of the Cold War. So the contestation between great power had always been, the strategic backdrop for the history of Southeast Asian nations, including of Indonesia, and that also shaped attitude towards great power. So there are always these concerns that the great powers would want to intervene in the domestic affairs of the countries in the region. Also, their policy could divide Southeast Asia again. So the growing rivalry between the US and China, this is like back to the future, that this competition that could become, so critical again, that more competition and less cooperation, which make it into a zero-sum game, that would force countries in the region to have to pick sides again, which of course is not something that any Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, would welcome. The default position of ASEAN countries, and Indonesia is the largest member of ASEAN and seen to be a natural leader within ASEAN, is for Southeast Asia to enjoy its strategic autonomy, to enjoy its agency, managing relations with external powers on our terms, engaging all sides and taking advantage of all that external powers have to offer. And a bit of competition is good because it enhances, the leverage of smaller countries if there are a bit of competitions. Because if it's too much concert between the great powers, it also leaves very little room to maneuver for the smaller and middle countries, middle powers. But too much competition, if there is no room for cooperation between the great powers, that would also squeeze the smaller countries. And this is something that that is the worst case scenario for Indonesia and ASEAN countries as a whole. So we do not wish to see that kind of scenario unfolding.
How does Indonesia view the current status of trade that it has with the United States today? Does it want to see trade ties expanded? Does it want to see increased U.S. investment activity in Indonesia? What's the general thoughts in Jakarta?
Well, the general thought clearly, the Jokowi administration focuses most of its diplomatic efforts on economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy comprises of 3 aspects: TTI, trade, tourism, investment. So it wants to increase trade with both traditional and non-traditional partners. And the United States is one of our oldest trading partners, Indonesia's largest trading partners. It used to be the largest market for Indonesia. Now the US has been usurped in that position by China. China is now the largest trading destination, a trading partner for Indonesia. But the US remains very important because it's the second largest trading partner for Indonesia. And of course, tourism, unfortunately, because of COVID, there's not much tourism. And now, before COVID, China has become also one of the largest sources of tourism and investment. Now, in US investment used to be, top 5 in Indonesia, but unfortunately, it is lagging behind. Now China is number 2, and then plus Hong Kong. Hong Kong is number 3. Number 1 is Singapore. You can argue that a lot of the Singapore investments probably comes from also from the United States, but when it comes to the the feasible statistics, the US is not one of the top 5s anymore. The top 5s are Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan. And clearly, Indonesia would like to see more investment from the United States. A lot of the US investments have traditionally been in mining, oil and gas, but also in the service industry, banking, insurance, and so on. And Indonesia would like to see more of US investment in areas which would create values for Indonesia, would create also jobs for Indonesia, and would also assist Indonesia in what it needs most, namely infrastructure. And this, unfortunately, is not there yet because the US, led mostly by the private sector, it's not that keen to invest in the infrastructure development because the return of investment is probably much longer down the road. And this has forced Indonesia to rely much more, for example, on what China has to offer under the the BRI initiatives from China, the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, also from Japan. So Japan and China are competing to build railroads, highways, and so on. We would like to see the United States to come in here because there have been criticism, for example, about the nature of Chinese investment, whether it was in the best interest of Indonesia in the long run, whether in terms from perspectives of governance or environment, or the debt trap issue. So yeah, we would like to see more of the US investment, not just in areas which the US had played in the past, but also in new areas.
So Indonesia will move its national capital from Jakarta to, I believe, East Kalimantan province. What are the reasons behind this? How long will it take, and how much will that cost?
Well, that was very much top of mind during the early, during the first Jokowi administration. There were studies being made. It would cost a lot of money. I don't have it top of my head, but the reason is both the push factors and the pull factors. It's a lot of the push factors that Jakarta environmentally is considered to be no longer sustainable because you've just seen the latest flooding in Jakarta. The city is sinking basically. It's not able to support the growth anymore. It's not much place to grow. So from the environmental point of view, there's been long debates about the need to move the capital out of Jakarta. The idea about Kalimantan, actually, that was first mooted during the time of President Sukarno, because it is right in the middle of Indonesia geographically. And there's always this criticism that Jakarta and Java have controlled Indonesia politically, economically, socially. So there is this reality, not just perceptions, that the eastern part of Indonesia has tended to be sidelined. They do not have access to the best and brightest in terms of investment and human resources. So moving the capital physically to the center would also make it much better, for Indonesia to be unified. We are unified politically, but economically, there are still gaps between the eastern part of Indonesia and the western part of Indonesia. So there are some of these arguments, but a lot of criticisms have come about that this is not an easy undertaking. It is not something that you can just do it, like Myanmar, the government did from Yangon to Naypyidaw. It's a lot of considerations that need to be discussed, and also in terms of the financing behind it. is going to be very, very costly. Not just the money terms, but also moving people, it's not going to be that easy. So COVID came, and the discussions about moving the capital to East Kalimantan has been put back at the back burner because the focus now is in recovering from COVID. So we'll have to see, how it will go about, because it also needs a change of law, because according to our law, Jakarta is the capital. So we'll see, what happens, because if he goes back into the debates, I'm sure that, Indonesia is a very politicized country. There are a lot of different points of views. Eventually, maybe it will come about, but it's not going to be something that, Jokowi dreamt about leaving already a functioning capital city when he leaves office. I don't think that's going to happen, this now.
You raised the issue of Myanmar moving their national capital. It reminded me, of course, of the coup that the military staged there on February 1. I know that your foreign minister, Ms. Marsudi, has been meeting with different ASEAN states as well as with her counterpart from Myanmar, I guess urging restraint. How ought both ASEAN and Washington handle relations with Myanmar going forward after this coup? What should be done?
Well, the most important thing at the moment is, of course, to urge restraints, because there are large-scale demonstrations, and we do not want to see any incidents which would lead to loss of lives. So the most important thing at the moment is, and in fact, the Indonesian Prime Minister has urged that, for the military and the police in Myanmar to exercise restraint, not so that they will not lead to loss of lives. And secondly, to talk to the military and also to the NLD leaders. Indonesia and ASEAN countries would like to see that democracy be restored as soon as possible. Ideally, the military could be forced to hand back power, and as of like in the 1st February, that is ideally. But at the moment, the military has, has taken power, and this is like what they did in the past. But clearly, we do not want to see this kind of situation where the military will isolate Myanmar again, because the military can survive that kind of isolation. They've done that in the past. But the Myanmar people will suffer. So I think Indonesia, ASEAN, and the dialogue partners, including the United States and China here in particular, we really need to be able to talk, what would be the best way forward. And this is not going to be very popular, because a lot of people in Myanmar, particularly from the, they're very angry, of course, the NGOs and so on. Their instinctive reaction would be, just sanction the military, isolate them, and force them to give up power. They're probably not willing to see the military being allowed to sit at the table for negotiations, because they would think that, that was giving the military some credibility. But I think not talking to the military is not an option either. So we have to make clear that, we do not recognize the military. We condemn their coup d'etat, because it violates what ASEAN stands for. It violates the ASEAN Charter, and also violates, Myanmar's democratic principles. But at the same time, we need to be able to engage with Myanmar. And the most important thing is that for big powers not to play politics here. The last thing the ASEAN wants is to be seen for the big powers, for the US-China rivalry to play out in Myanmar, with China, for example, supporting the military, and the United States and other democratic countries supporting the NLD, and then having the new Cold War being played out in Myanmar, because then everybody would lose. ASEAN will lose, the Myanmar people will lose. So the most important thing is, I think, for Indonesia and ASEAN countries to bring all the dialogue partners also to the table, and make sure that we are all on the same page. having democracy restored in Myanmar, but in a sustainable way. Wishing the military away is not a realistic option. I mean, this is so many studies been written about civil-military relations. Myanmar is a classic case. Indonesia is a case. Egypt is a case, and unfortunately, the track record is not always on the sides of civilian democrats, especially with democratic regression happening in many countries. So we have to look at it in a more realistic manner, but the end goal should be the immediate restoration of democracy in Myanmar.
So we're in 2021. We have a new administration in Washington. What are some of the important issues facing the relationship between Jakarta and Washington today? And if you could give President Biden 1 to 2 pieces of advice on how to handle the relationship between our two countries, what would that be?
Well, we are in a good position in a way. At the bilateral level, there are no problems, despite the Trump's lack of attention, to Southeast Asia. At the bilateral level, there have not been any major issues. U.S., the United States, and Indonesia are strategic partners, in fact, comprehensive strategic partners. That cooperation continues, wide-ranging cooperations on economics, on political and security, on social issues and science and technology, education, and so on. What would be my advice would be that the United States needs to be much more modest in its approach to Indonesia and the region, in view of the fact that in the past, the United States has tended to take a more moral high ground, for example, on democracy and human rights. But after what has happened in the United States itself, in the past 4 years, and including the siege of the Capitol and so on, we can see that all countries, whether it's established democracies or democracies that are still at this infant stage, one that is still fighting for consolidation, like Indonesia, we all have the same problems. We need to be much more humble that we don't have all the answers. So I would say that when we're talking about Biden's policy, we'll focus a lot more on democracy and human rights. And I would argue that it would be much more successful if it is done in a more collaborative manner, engaging with all countries, and in a more inclusive manner. The divisive policy of either you are for us or against us is not going to be working anymore, because there's a lot of shades of gray, and I think for democracy to be much more sustainable, the way we do it, it's not perfect. So a lot of criticisms, and sometimes talking to the bad guys, need to be done, dealing with the military in a way that is not going to be totally acceptable to the purists, for example. But sometimes in the real world, we have to be able to engage with all sides. And I think that's important. So on democracy, I hope the United States and Indonesia can be partners here and see, what is not just morally acceptable, but also at the practical level, what could be implementable and be sustainable in the long run. And on the economy issues, Indonesia would really like to see more US engagement and commitment. So in the past, the US talks a lot about engaging with Southeast Asia. It's true that Southeast Asia is the largest recipient of US investment, but it seems to be lost in the message somehow. I don't know whether it's bad PR on the US side, but China seems to have better image here. So the US needs to do much more, and in the past, it's always been said, that when it comes to economic, it's China. When it comes to security, it's the United States. I like to see much more, the United States being a much more holistic power here. That the US is around diplomatically, economically, as well at the security level. And that means sustained engagement. And that, unfortunately, is where the problem is, why the US is still there, but perceptions matter when the US does not send the highest level representation to ASEAN-related meetings. Even if the US representatives are there, but when the president's not there, or the vice president's not there, or the secretary of state's not there, the US is absent. Mm. And unfortunately, perceptions shape reality here. How people look at the US depends on not just on the reality, but also on that perception. And there's also this concern, this sharp swing in US policy. Deep engagement at one time, and then total neglect on the other. Multilateral cooperation today and total disengagement, America first tomorrow. How can we truly trust the US? Well, for Southeast Asia, we can't. We don't trust any big powers, because at the end of the day, smaller countries and big middle power countries are just collateral for a lot of these powers. So that also forces ASEAN, to be much more resilient, to ensure that we do not become too dependent on any one country. Ensure our strategic autonomy. But what we hope from the United States is that, because that should be strengthened, it is in the US interest to ensure that ASEAN is able to play this agency role, to ensure its strategic autonomy, that it is not vulnerable, to external power intervention, whether it is from the US or from the China or any other powers.
So last month, Indonesia launched one of the world's largest COVID-19 vaccine drives, with the country using the China-produced CoronaVac vaccine. How is the vaccine campaign going, and how do voters view President Joko Widodo's handling of the pandemic overall?
The handling of the pandemic during the early days was clearly could have been better, because the government did not take the COVID threat seriously. So there was a delay in taking action, in closing the borders, for example. And secondly, there's also this mixed policy, not unlike the policy in the US, because the government had to balance between controlling the spread of the pandemic and ensuring that social economic activities do not suffer, because the government is not really in a position to impose a total lockdown, because how can you ensure that people do not starve? So that mixed policies have continued to be debated within the countries. Some tend to argue for better policy of limiting social activities and ensuring that people stay at home, while others argue that we cannot afford to have this total lockdown. And the result is that the virus continued to spread, and death continue. People dying of COVID continue to increase. Indonesia is now the largest, the largest sufferers of COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. So of course we are also the largest country in Southeast Asia. But the fact of the matter is that we are not as good as Vietnam in controlling this. But on the whole, the president's handling of it, while it's been criticized, Jokowi's approval rating continues to be high, because while he's considered to be less efficient in the public health side of it, in the social economic support, he's seen to be quite successful, because the social safety network and so on has been quite vigorous. And this is generally been quite accepted. The vaccine campaign, it's ongoing now. The priorities are, of course, public health people. Now the people who are doing public service in general, including journalists. The moment journalists are being vaccinated, so they will be doing this, for the next 2 weeks. So hopefully more and more people will get access to vaccines. The debates are now, there's also people who are spreading campaigns about the danger of vaccination. So there are some who argue that vaccine is not good for you for different reasons. So there are also attempts, regulations that being put in place, whether you need to give tough sanctions against people who are anti-vaccinations. But at the moment, even those who need vaccines are still queuing for that. I'm still, on the line. My office has just registered me, so I don't really know when I'll get the vaccines. But on the whole, there is hopes that we will get herd immunity by next year.
Indonesia is a vast archipelago ranging, over 17,500 islands with various maritime interests that range from the seafood industry to natural resources to conventional naval interests. What sort of weapon systems and capabilities does Indonesia require today for its national security?
It has shifted, yeah. In the past, the focus has always been on the army. Although Indonesia has this archipelagic outlook, we are the world's largest archipelago, controlling sea lanes, and our resources are actually, a lot of them are maritime in nature. But in the past, during the military-dominated New Order government, the focus has been very much on domestic security, where the main threats to security has always been seen to be internal, from separatist movements, social conflicts and ideological conflicts and so on. So the stress has been very much on control of the people. So a lot of the resources were given to the army. And the army's control also not just through coercive force, but also through politics, by its involvement in social, political, and economic activities. There's dui fungsi, there's dual functions of the military. Now, after Reformasi, the military is supposed to be totally disengaged from politics, at least on paper. It's supposed to be, constitutionally, the military is no longer allowed to be actively involved in politics. And that, according to our law on the military, the primary function of the military is to protect the country against external attacks. So the focus is on external defense. So more money should be given to the Air Force and the Navy. And at the moment, the government has tried that since the ISBY presidency, from the first period of ISBY presidency until now, the money has been distributed to all three functions, because the internal aspects is still a major issue for Indonesia. But at the same time, with regional uncertainty, real threats from outside, not just non-traditional threats, but also traditional threats to security, more attention needs to be paid to the Navy and Air Force. But lack of resources is still a challenge for Indonesia. So Indonesia is still at the stage of trying to build its minimum, capability. But the Defense Ministry now actually gets a high percentage of the national budget, though it will still take time, to build up real capability. Indonesia's strategic outlook tends to be inward-looking anyway. So even when we build sufficient capability, it will be for not forward defense, but still, what they call defense in depth, and trying to protect, Indonesian maritime boundaries, and make sure that threats do not, external hostile forces, whether it's countries or non-state actors, will not make use of Indonesian waters against Indonesian interests.
Last year, Indonesia's foreign ministry filed a complaint with China over alleged violations of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone waters in the vicinity of the Natuna Islands. Just for background for our audience members, China claims almost all the South China Sea, and the claims boundaries are defined loosely by Beijing's 9-dash line chart, which extends hundreds of miles south of China's exclusive economic zone waters. This month, the chief of Indonesia's Maritime Security Agency warned that China's new Coast Guard law heightened the risk of a spillover conflict into Indonesia's territorial waters around the Natuna Islands. Dr. Anwar, there's clearly a risk of conflict escalation here, at least in my view. What is the latest with this ongoing situation? What ought to be done about it? And as a follow-up, what is the state of Indonesia-China relations today, and where are they headed?
Yeah. Firstly, regarding China's claims on the South China Sea and the 9-dash lines that impinges on Indonesians' exclusive economic zones on North Natuna Sea, Indonesia does not recognize that because China's claims is against the UNCLOS 1982. And UNCLOS 1982 is clearly the most important regulatory framework which should govern relations. Now, Indonesia does not see itself as a party to the conflict in the South China Sea, and does not have a say, on who claims what's there. What it wants to see is that disputes in the South China Sea should be resolved peacefully, or at least managed peacefully. I think there is a recognition that when it comes to these territorial disputes, it's not something that can be resolved easily, even at the bilateral level, between Indonesia and Malaysia, between Indonesia and Singapore, between Indonesia and Malaysia, there's still some territorial disputes there. But the most important thing that, there should be a regional mechanism for managing the conflict. And Indonesia and ASEAN and China are working towards that with this more binding code of conduct on the South China Sea. So refraining from the use of threat of force, and trying to turn an area of conflict to an area of cooperation without prejudicing, the claims of any one country. I think that is the most that we can do. There's concerns that this arming of China's coast guards. What China is trying to do is, of course, not to use its navy, because then it becomes state to state. While if it is Coast Guard, it's more like policing action. Now, from the Indonesian side, it's also the same. Indonesia is also trying to strengthen its Coast Guard. So both countries are trying to avoid a navy to navy, which could be at the level of state and escalate the conflicts into a warlike stance. But there is clearly concern, if the Coast Guard carries out a warlike activity, against in the South China Sea, that would create real serious problems as well. So Indonesia has protested against that clearly. Now, at the general level, Indonesia-China relations have become much stronger. At the economic level, as you said, Indonesia and China's economic relations have become closer. China and Indonesia also have comprehensive strategic partnership agreement, just like Indonesia and the United States. So China is not exclusive here, but there are a number of countries which Indonesia considers to be strategic partners. There is a desire to continue to engage with China. China's growing power is a fact of life. It's not something that you can wish away. Now, in the past, Indonesia, during the Cold War, because of domestic politics, its strong anti-communist policy, and also because of China's policy then exporting ideology, for example, Indonesia had tried to insulate itself. Despite its free and active foreign policy during most of the New Order period, Indonesia did not have diplomatic relations with China, and Indonesia had very close relations with the United States. So, you might say that it's balancing China in that way. And now, in the post-Cold War period, where China is emerging as as a global economic power. The choice is either we engage with China or we don't engage with China. Both have costs. Not engaging with China is even more costly than engaging with China. So it's better to engage with China, but on terms that we are comfortable with. So it has to be rule-based. It has, respect for international law, and also, it has to be multilateral also in nature. Indonesia's approach towards regional architecture has always been inclusive in nature. And we like to support more cooperative security, where we find common ground, turning conflicts into areas of cooperation.
So the United Nations estimates that over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China are detained in what they call vocational camps or re-educational camps, going back to 2017. And Indonesia's two largest Muslim organizations initially were somewhat quiet on the issue, but they later called for China to end what they described as human rights violations of the Uyghurs. President Widodo has been hesitant to confront China, it appears. In a 2019 interview with the Financial Times, I recall him saying that he had no knowledge of the situation or was unable to comment. And it seemed to be a signal that Beijing has become quite influential in Asia, and it's increasingly able to control narratives. Going forward, as the elected leader of the world's largest Muslim country, will President Widodo begin to speak out more about this ongoing tragedy?
I can't say for President Widodo. As you noted, Muhammadiyah and NU in the beginning were not as vocal about the human rights abuses against Uyghur. And I think the claim of lack of real knowledge is probably true, because China, of course, has closed the area to the outside world. So the message that comes out has been very much controlled by China. This is different from the Rohingya tragedy, where you have really, on your face tragedy, particularly with asylum seekers coming to Southeast Asia. So that lack of, horror visuals probably have been a factor also in the hesitancy to make comment. From civil society, there have been disappointments towards the Indonesian government's reticence to criticize China. And I think there is some justification, there is an unwillingness to criticize China openly. But this is not just because of economic issues. Indonesia has tended to be much more reluctant to comment openly about happenings within a particular country, because what they say, people living in glass houses. Indonesia itself also have a lot of domestic problems, and it's always very sensitive about outside world commenting on Indonesia. So there is, so it's not just about China, about a lot of other countries as well. You don't hear the Indonesian government calling on the U.S. government, to pay more attention to its human rights, its race relations and so on, because there is always this perception, that we do not want people to criticize us, so we are also very hesitant to criticize others. And when we do criticize, it tends to be less on the, on the open platform, less megaphone diplomacy and more closed-door diplomacy. At the closed-door diplomacy, the Indonesian government does convey its concerns to China. It just doesn't want to do it as a public relations exercise just to gain points.
In the remaining time we have left, I want to be respectful of your time. I wanted to ask you, can you recommend any books about Indonesia for our American audience?
Well, there are not that many books on Indonesia, but in terms of there's a common book I actually have, there's a book by Theodore Friend.
Mhm.
I'll show you.
Okay.
He's just passed away, but this is a well-known American scholar. This is a good book for beginner, I think. It talks about Indonesian destinies. It talks about different aspects of Indonesia. So this should be a good starting point for general readers. This was, it's published in 2003 by Harvard University Press. So I would say that, this is a good beginning because it talks about Sukarno, Suharto, succession, and so on. So
Indonesian
they're quite a number, yeah. But okay. I would say that this is a good read.
Oh, excellent! That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you. What projects are you currently working on, and do you have any plans in the works for a book?
There has always been plans to do that, but unfortunately, there are just so many things happening. So at the moment, I'm engaged in a lot of smaller research. So writing about ASEAN centrality, writing about Indonesian foreign policies, but more for parts of the book. When I do get to retire, then that is my plan.
So one remaining question, if I may. Once COVID is under control, people are going to start traveling again, Americans among them. And for Americans who do travel to Indonesia, in addition to Bali, because it is so beautiful, are there other locations in Indonesia, maybe one or two locations that you can recommend for future American tourists to visit when they're in your country?
Well, Indonesia is so large and such diversity of beauties and cultural attractiveness. So it depends very much on what you are interested in. For those, the government is actually developing what is called 10 Balis. So it's developing tourist destinations in North Sumatra, around the Lake Toba area, in Papua, the Raja Ampat areas, and also in Nusa Tenggara around Lombok, and there's also in North Sulawesi. So there are many parts. So it depends what you like. For the younger generations who like adventure and surfing and so on, there are plenty of places to go around, for diving. Those who likes to do for cultural, who visit culturally, Central Java, of course, but Sumatra. I come from West Sumatra. I think that my area, which is matrilineal, when people talk about whether Islam and modernity and traditional traditions can get together, West Sumatra is a place where you go, because we are very religious. It's rather Puritan, it's in terms of Islamic observation, but it is also the largest functioning matrilineal system. So I come from matrilineal, so that means that lineage properties pass through the your mother's lines, and also has interesting architecture, beautiful scenery, unlike very similar to Bali, and food. When you go throughout Indonesia, nasi padang, that's where it comes from. And of course, Lake Toba is a beautiful area with this natural lake from this largest volcanic eruption, and that area is being developed as well. So there's so much to offer.
Those are excellent suggestions. Our guest today has been Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar of the Habibie Center in Jakarta, Indonesia. Dr. Anwar, thank you for taking the time and providing such important commentary on Indonesia and its relations with the world. Thank you for helping us to understand this better.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nova.
Please be well.
Thank you.